Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church. This, of course, is the program where we harvest the fruits of the last week in journalism on the Vatican and global church beat. This week, we're going with a little bit of a showbiz motif, so let's raise the curtain and start the show. Here's what we've got. We begin with General Hospital. Pope Francis, for the second time in the last 3 months, is in Rome's Gemelli Hospital, this time to repair a hernia on his abdominal wall. We'll explain the latest and also what it all might mean. Then, second up this week, we've got Sending the Wolf, not a reference to Quentin Tarantino and Pulp Fiction, and a famous line from that film that I cannot repeat here because this is a family show. But instead, we're talking about the story of St. Francis of Assisi and the Wolf of Gubbio, invoked over the weekend by Cardinal Matteo Zuppi to describe his peace mission with Ukraine and Russia. We'll unpack what that's all about. Third up, Taken. Not a reference to the movie franchise with Liam Neeson, but instead the infamous 1858 kidnapping of a Jewish child named Edgaro Mortara from his family by papal edict, and the request for a reform in church law being made by a descendant of that Jewish child. Then we've got summer blockbusters. Pope Francis, assuming he comes out of this most recent hospitalization with flying colors, and it seems currently that that's the prognosis, is planning to take 3 big-time trips between now and the end of September. We'll explain why those trips highlight not merely the today of the Catholic Church, but in some ways also potentially its tomorrow. And finally, guess who's coming to dinner, starring not Spencer Tracy, but an Italian Nobel Laureate who, some years ago, publicly dissed Pope Benedict XVI. We'll explain why that is causing a bit of controversy here in Italy as well. All that and more is on this special showbiz edition of Last Week in the Church, so please stay where you are. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. We begin this week with General Hospital, Pope Francis's most recent visit to Rome's Gemelli Hospital. In this case, the Pope made a surprise visit to the hospital on Tuesday, which was publicly unexplained by the Vatican. But then on Wednesday, we figured out what was going on as he went back to the Gemelli to undergo an operation to repair a hernia in his abdominal wall. That is a tear that had opened up along the incision of a previous surgery. We originally thought it was his 2021 surgery to remove part of his colon, but now we understand it actually was a previously undisclosed 1980 surgery while he was still in Argentina, a gallbladder operation. And apparently that incision had reopened, his bowel was protruding, so surgeons had to put in a mesh that is a kind of plastic net to repair that tear. It is, by all accounts, a fairly, there is no such thing as a minor surgery, right? Especially when you're talking about an 86-year-old patient. But nevertheless, given all that, it is apparently a fairly straightforward procedure. The surgery lasted about 3 hours. The Pope apparently came through it in good shape, was alert and responsive, even joking around later Wednesday afternoon. Now, bear in mind, we record this show on Monday. You don't see it until at the earliest on Tuesday, so it's possible we will be a little bit behind the news. But the latest information we have as of this recording is that the Pope's recovery continues to be strong and all moving in the right direction. We were told Sunday evening that he had actually begun moving again, that is, taking a few steps. Surgeons, his medical team, is trying to do everything they can to get the Pope not to move around very much, actually, because they want to make sure that the wound around that new mesh heals properly and that it takes. They don't want to reopen it, which would, of course, require yet another surgical intervention. So the challenge right now is to get this peripatetic energizer bunny of a pope to basically sit still for as long as humanly possible so that this all can follow its natural course. In light of that advice, the Pope actually skipped the public recitation of the Angelus prayer, his noontime Angelus, on Sunday. Instead, recited the prayer in private. It was the first time he has skipped an Angelus, though, of course, not the first time he has skipped a public appointment for some health-related reason. Bottom line here is, look, when you have an 86-year-old man who has undergone, well, now not 3, but actually 4 surgeries, since we learned about one we didn't previously know about, who is increasingly confined to the use of a wheelchair or a cane because of, debilitating nerve conditions, sciatica, and also because of knee problems. In other words, an 86-year-old with his medical history, you've got to be a little bit concerned. On the other hand, everything we know about how the Pope is doing would suggest that he is recovering well, recovering strongly, and assuming that this mesh takes hold, probably will be feeling better than he has in quite some time and could be good to go for quite some time. Okay, so that's the bottom line in terms of the health front. Now, 2 other notes I will make before we leave General Hospital behind. One is about Vatican communications. Look, I'm wrong a lot, but I don't admit it very much. But, here's a case in which basically I'm going to have to eat a little bit of humble pie. On Tuesday, when the Pope made this unannounced visit to the Gemelli for what was described at the time, I would note, as a checkup, that is, we were given no more information, I wrote a column Wednesday morning sort of complaining about the inadequacies of Vatican communications when it comes to the Pope's health, how they don't really tell us anything. Well, and let me point out that it took the Vatican 3.5 hours on Tuesday even to announce that the Pope had been to the Gemelli. He had gone and come back, and everyone knew this before the Vatican even confirmed it. All right, so I wasn't entirely wrong to say that this was not their finest hour. Nevertheless, has to be said that since then, Vatican communications have taken a step into the 21st century. We got a press conference on Wednesday after the surgery with the surgeon, Italian doctor Sergio Alfieri. We got another one on Saturday with an update on the Pope's condition. Now, it has to be said that as of this recording on Monday, we have not seen any photos or any video of Pope Francis, but we have at least heard directly from the medical personnel treating him. That is a step forward with respect to what had been the pattern, which is we get the only health dates we ever got were from the Vatican spokesman, Matteo Bruni, and I'll say it again, a fine human being, a personal friend of mine, but, not a doctor. So, at least in this case, we are hearing directly from the medical personnel episodically. Credit where credit is due. That is a step forward. Memo to the powers that be in the Vatican. Let this be a lesson to you. People will be a lot more calm if you tell them what's going on. And then, final note, before we go too far down the rabbit hole of saying this is the beginning of the end for Pope Francis, I would just like to recall for you the story of Pope Leo XIII, who was the oldest pope to still be sitting on the throne of Peter at the time his papacy ended. He was 93 when he died in 1903. Pope Francis is the oldest pope since Leo XIII to be reigning, so the oldest pope in the last 120 years. When Pope Leo XIII was 89, he had to go in for a surgery. A cyst was diagnosed that had to be removed. Many people thought that was the beginning of the end. In fact, the surgery was a complete success, and Leo XIII reigned another 4 years, which is a full presidential term in the United States. My point, don't write Pope Francis off. Okay? All right, so we move on to Sending the Wolf, which, of course, brings to mind Pulp Fiction, but actually, more recently, it brings to mind a public appearance by Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Bologna, the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, and the Pope's designated troubleshooter, mediator, peacemaker, in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Zuppi recently spent 2 days in Ukraine, speaking with, among others, President Volodymyr Zelensky. And this weekend, he appeared at a festival in Bologna, organized by the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, in which he took questions. And I suppose the big headline is, Zuppi said, he expects to go to Moscow very soon. He said there is interest and attention from authorities in the Russian government and also from the Russian Orthodox Church, including Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He said he has actually picked up signals of welcome from the Russians. And so the clear indication he gave at this appearance was that having gone to Kiev, he now expects to go to Moscow. He, however, did signal he does not expect to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin. When asked by the journalist conducting this conversation, does that mean you're going to see Putin? Zuppi's response was, I said there's interest from the Russian government, not from Putin. So it looks like Zuppi will be in Moscow. He will probably see Patriarch Kirill and, some muckety-mucks in the Kremlin, but perhaps not Putin. In presenting all of this, Zuppi was asked, well, what about the criticism that the Vatican is too even-handed, not, publicly condemning, Russia's aggression, the fact that Ukraine is the victim and Russia is the victimizer and all of that. And in response, Zuppi cited the story of St. Francis of Assisi and the wolf of Gubbio. He said, look, when this wolf was terrorizing the people of Gubbio, St. Francis went to talk to him. And he didn't pretend the wolf is not doing bad stuff. Said he didn't make discounts, but he tried to reach out to the wolf and find an accommodation. And what he offered him, of course, was, hey, if the people of Gubbio feed you, will you stop eating them? And the wolf basically took the deal. And he said when the wolf died 3 years later, the people of Gubbio were actually sad because they had become friends. And so Zuppi was holding up the famous story of Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio as a model for his mission as a potential peacemaker. We will see if Zuppi has the same luck with Zelensky, Putin, the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the other international powers involved in this conflict, as Francis of Assisi did with the Wolf of Gubbio. All right, third up this week, Taken. Again, we're not talking about Liam Neeson, but we are talking about the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, 1858 case of Edgardo Mortara. This was the child of a prominent Jewish family in Bologna. They had a Catholic maid who was worried because the little baby Mortara at one point got sick. She was worried he might die. So secretly she baptized him. 7 years later, she acknowledged this to some friends. This got to the head of the papal police in Bologna. Church law at the time said that a Catholic child could not be raised by a non-Catholic family. So the papal police removed Edgardo Mortara from his family and sent him to Rome, originally to a home for baptized kids from non-Catholic families. So they actually had a residence for such children. Now, this was the middle of the 19th century, not the Middle Ages. There was a newly independent secular press at the time that got wind of all of this and sort of went to town on it, made it a cause célèbre. It had an enormous backlash for the papacy under Pope Pius IX. Public opinion read strongly against the Pope. Nevertheless, Pius IX kind of dug in his heels, refused to give ground, actually brought the young Mortara boy into the Vatican and raised him almost as his own son. Edgardo Mortara went on as an adult to be ordained as a Catholic priest. He died in Belgium in 1940 at the age of 88. But the case never really went away. The damaging effects for the papacy were obvious. Bologna essentially rebelled and was stripped away from the Papal States 1 year later. A year after that, the Kingdom of Piedmont and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south united, declared the new Kingdom of Italy. 10 years after that, the Papal States were gone amid Italian unification, and many historians believe the Mortara case had a lot to do with that. Now, flash forward to the present. There is a new movie in Italian theaters right now called Rapito, which means kidnapped. It's about the Mortara case. There's a new novel out about the Mortara case called Place Under This Sky, and that has all put it back in the news. There is a descendant of Edgardo Mortara, Elena Mortara di Verioli, who teaches, of all things, Anglo-American literature at Rome's Tor Vergata University. She recently appeared at a presentation for this new novel, along with Rabbi Riccardo De Segni, who is the head of Rome's Jewish community. And they together presented an appeal to Pope Francis for a reform, what they consider to be a long overdue reform to the Church's Code of Canon Law. If you look it up, Canon 868 of the Code of Canon Law, in its second and final section, says that an infant of Catholic parents or even of non-Catholic parents may be licitly baptized against the will of the parents if it is in danger of death. And Mortara and De Segni, other Jewish leaders in Rome, are calling on the Pope to essentially abrogate or repeal that codicil of canon law. It's a tough case for the Pope, right? Because on the one hand, classic Catholic doctrine about baptism says it's essential for salvation. So to deny in someone in danger of death the right to be baptized would, you can imagine how doctrinal traditionalists and purists would react to that. On the other hand, of course, there is also Catholic-Jewish dialogue. There is the Church's teaching on religious freedom, respect for the rights of parents. So, it's a tough deal. We will see how Pope Francis handles it. But when he gets out of the Gemelli, it's another thing that is going to be waiting on his desk to deal with. All right, next up this week, summer blockbusters. So, assuming Pope Francis continues to recover and is in good shape, he is scheduled to make 3 trips between now and the end of December. He is supposed to go to Lisbon in Portugal for World Youth Day, August 2nd through the 6th. He is supposed to go to Mongolia, basically August 31st through September 4th. And then at the end of September, he's supposed to go to Marseille to conclude a meeting on the Mediterranean region. Now, from one point of view, the focus on each of these trips is, of course, going to be how is Pope Francis doing right now? How does he handle the rigors of these journeys? But inevitably, given his health history, his age, and all of that, people will also be asking the question, do these trips maybe put a spotlight on a potential successor? And in each case, I'm going to tell you the answer is yes. In Portugal, his host is going to be the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon, Cardinal do Nascimento, but I don't think he's probably the potential successor who's going to be spotlighted. I think it's another Portuguese prelate, Cardinal José Tolentino do Mendoca, who is currently the head of the Vatican's new dicastery for culture and education. He is a widely celebrated Portuguese poet and intellectual. He was selected by Pope Francis to deliver the annual retreat for the Roman Curia in Lent. He is somebody that Pope Francis obviously likes and esteems a great deal, certainly has the intellectual wherewithal and heft to be taken seriously as a papal contender. So keep your eyes on Cardinal Tolentino do Mendoca when the Pope goes to his native country of Portugal. Now, let me skip ahead for a moment to the trip to Marseille at the end of September. There you have Cardinal Jean-Marc Aveline of Marseille. He is the only cardinal right now to be running a French diocese. He is a pied noir, that is, he was born in Algeria to French citizens of Algeria who were born, worked, and lived in Algeria. They were native Algerians, basically, until Algerian independence, when they were driven out of the country and shipped back to France, where the French weren't really very excited about their return either, because they became competitors for jobs, housing, privileges from the state. In other words, they were, for a while, people without a country. So Aveline understands the plight of migrants today in a way that few other members of the College of Cardinals do. Definitely a Pope Francis guy, someone else to have your eyes on. when the Pope is in Marseille. Now, in between, of course, is this trip to Mongolia, where the host will be Cardinal Giorgio Marenga, who is, at 48, the youngest member of the College of Cardinals. He is a consolata missionary. Now, I don't think he is probably himself what we would call a papabile, that is, a candidate to be pope. I mean, I can't really imagine the other cardinals electing a pope at the age of 48 when he is guaranteed to reign probably for at least 4 decades and maybe more. You know, the old joke about Leo the 13th used to be, we thought we were electing a holy father, we got an eternal father. Oh, well, that would certainly be the case of Cardinal Giorgio as well. But I do think he is emblematic of the kind of cardinal Pope Francis has created. He has deliberately tried to give red hats to the peripheries, right? To forgotten or neglected, isolated, marginal corners of the earth. Mongolia, I believe, is the 3rd most sparsely inhabited country in the world. Now, it does have geopolitical significance, of course, because it's located right between China and Russia, 2 of the great superpowers of our time, and no doubt that helps explain why Pope Francis is going there. But my point is that the Cardinal of Mongolia, which has never had a cardinal before, is not one of the traditional power brokers of the Catholic Church. And frankly, the College of Cardinals right now is stuffed with such personalities, people who come from out-of-the-way places about whom we really don't know very much. I mean, let me ask you, as a thought exercise, do you right now have a good sense of how you think the Cardinal of Mongolia might vote in the next conclave? Or the Cardinal of Lake Cayenne in Haiti? Or, you know, these cardinals from the Pacific Islands that Pope Francis has created? I mean, I don't think anybody does. In other words, the trip to Mongolia spotlights the kind of cardinal who is going to have a voice, you know, as the Italians would say, una voce in capitolo, you know, a role, an influence in the next conclave, and illustrates, therefore, why this next conclave is so incredibly difficult to handicap, because we just don't know what makes many of these cardinals tick, and therefore what they're likely to be looking for the next time they have to elect a pope. All right, finally this week, we have Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And this is not a reference to the famous Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, Sidney Poitier movie, although if you haven't seen it, for the love of God, do. I mean, it's just an absolute classic. But in this case, it is instead a reference to a gathering that took place here in Rome over the weekend, in which Pope Francis was originally supposed to participate, but of course could not because of his hospitalization at the Gemelli. But 30 or so Nobel laureates came together to sign a declaration on human fraternity inspired by Pope Francis's encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, in which human fraternity is the cornerstone concept. And basically the idea was for these Nobel laureates who represent the best of secular culture, secular learning, to join with the Pope. So you've got the secular world and the spiritual or religious world together, promoting human fraternity as a key to resolving the problems of humanity, from armed conflict, climate change, and on and on. You know, in other words, this was supposed to be a kind of feel-good photo op, right? But inevitably, you know, this is the Vatican, and nothing is ever entirely linear or uncomplicated. And so here's the wrinkle that emerged that is of particular interest to Italians, and that is, one of the Nobel laureates was a guy by the name of Giorgio Parisi. Parisi won the 2021 Nobel Prize in Physics, very distinguished physicist. Now, what makes this noteworthy is that in 2008, Pope Benedict XVI was supposed to deliver an address for the opening of the academic year at Rome's La Sapienza University. It is the major public secular university here in Rome, considered a citadel, if you like, of secular learning. At that time, 66 academics signed a letter of protest saying that it was inappropriate to ask the Pope to deliver this address because he represented what? I don't know, the obscurantism of the church through centuries, and that Pope Benedict in particular was an enemy of academic freedom because, as the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he had silenced theologians who taught at universities around the world, and so forth and so on. Now, later, and Pope Benedict, being the infinitely gracious and kind soul that he was, not wanting to give offense to anyone, voluntarily bowed out and said, okay, I won't come. I don't want to create a problem. He did release the address he was planning to give, by the way, in which he said, basically, we don't want to impose anything on anyone, but the church is a repository of centuries-old ethical wisdom. We just want to place it at the service of humanity. In other words, everyone had to admit, you know what, we may have overreacted here. Nevertheless, Parisi signed that letter and has never publicly repented, and he was part of this gathering this weekend. So, oh, and by the way, also last year he came out in favor of legalized euthanasia, which of course the Catholic Church opposes. So, if you are a sort of conservative or traditionalist Catholic inclined to be suspicious about ways in which Pope Francis and his Vatican team are not adequately respectful of Pope Benedict, then this would be, I guess, another plank in your indictment. On the other hand, if you are a fan of Pope Francis, you would see this as another example of the Pope promoting dialogue, even with people with whom he may have disagreements, and how that openness is a good thing, right? Whatever you make of it, it is nevertheless another thing here in Italy right now that is making some waves and fueling impressions of what the Italians would call a kind of spaccatura, that is a division between Pope Francis and his team and Pope Benedict and his guys. However real that may be, as opposed to simply perceived as a matter of debate, the fact that it is percolating, however, is not in question. All right, that is our show for this week. You can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site, cruxnow.com. We are still, by the way, promoting our GoFundMe campaign for our good friend and managing editor, Charles Collins, who is experiencing a severe health crisis. He needs your help. You can find information in the editor's note by me on the Crux site. If you can, please contribute. We would be eternally grateful. We will be back next week here. Same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and we will talk to you again very soon.